Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first session of the inaugural symposium hosted by the Clinic for Asylum, Refugee, and Immigrant Services, CARES, at the Villanova University Charles Woodger School of Law. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tasha. I'm a student at CARES Clinic and organizer of this panel, The Last 4 Years, Emergent Strategies for Immigrant Justice. Before we begin, I just have a few quick announcements. If you have a question during the program, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we are providing 1 free Pennsylvania CLE credit for this panel, thanks to a generous gift from our donor, Joseph Azrak. And if you're seeking the CLE credit for this program, you will need to fill out a course evaluation that will be sent at the end of the program today and is due back by the end of the day tomorrow. Only those who registered for this panel will receive the course evaluation needed to get the CLE credit. So if you are attending but didn't register, please send us a note in the Q&A so we can make sure you get the course evaluation. In the course evaluation, you will be asked for 2 secret words to help verify attendance, and I will be giving those words out during the program, but it's your responsibility to write them down. Per the Pennsylvania CLE board rules, Villanova is not allowed to share words with you if you miss them, so keep an eye out. And if you have any questions about CLE credit or other logistics, please use the Q&A function via Zoom. And lastly, we have created a resource page with links to relevant articles, other information related to the topic of this panel. If you want to delve into that further, the link to the website is posted in the chat and will also be emailed to you after the symposium. Now I will turn it over to Professor Caitlin Berry to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Tasha, and thank you for being such a fantastic facilitator and creating such a great program for us today. I'm really glad to be here, really looking forward to this conversation. For those of you that I haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Caitlin Berry, and I am the director of the clinical program, and I teach the farm worker clinic here at Villanova, where our clients are experiencing significant challenges related to immigration enforcement. And so looking forward to learning from our panelists today. Our first panelist is Vanessa Stine, who is an alumni of Villanova and an alumni of the Farm Worker Clinic, did 3 semesters in the Farm Worker Clinic and was such a fantastic advocate for her clients. It's no surprise that she has continued to be such a relentless force in the world of immigrants' rights. Vanessa joined the ACLU as an immigrants' rights attorney. Prior to that, she was an attorney with Justice at Work in Philadelphia. She joined Justice at Work with an Equal Justice Works fellowship that was focused on representing people who had been defrauded by practitioners who were claiming to offer legal services. It was a really, really creative and exciting project that she developed while she was still a student at Villanova. Our second panelist today is Qureshi. We're so thrilled to have here. is a staff attorney with the National Immigration Project and works on immigration enforcement issues, particularly those that impact low-income Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. She's a 2019 graduate of Yale Law School, where she studied and worked on issues related to immigration, Muslim civil rights, and international human rights law. And before law school, was a high school math teacher, which is super interesting. I always love hearing about what amazing things folks were doing out in the world before they came to law school. So Vanessa and thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Professor Berry and Villanova for having us.
Thanks so much.
So I think we can go ahead and get started thinking about reflections on the last 4 years, strategies that have found success in and out of the courtroom. So I thought we could start out thinking before the last 4 years and sort of what work, what experiences you brought into this moment of crisis, what lessons you had learned that served you in the last few years and made you such a fantastic resource for the communities that you represent.
I can start us off. Yeah, I think, you know, the last kind of 4 years have been really grueling and exhausting for a lot of reasons. And, you know, like the constant sort of systematic attacks on immigration from this administration, I think have really highlighted some of the injustices built within the system over the last few decades. And it's important to note that the current system that Trump is working with was built through bipartisan consensus. And Trump, simply inherited the system and actually hasn't made significant changes to the laws, passed by Congress, but instead has just used those laws that were at his disposal to sort of unleash this war on immigrants. That lesson is also like going to help us guide, hopefully in the change of administration, recognizing that this work, isn't going to end if we have sort of a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president, but in fact that what it does require is sort of a movement to completely overhaul this current system.
Vanessa, did you want to follow up on that?
Sure, yeah, I'll add that I agree with Humber first about sort of him, this administration utilizing the laws as they exist to enforce immigration law rather robustly. I guess I'll say sort of here in Pennsylvania, I think, when immigration enforcement was first ramped up in early 2017, I was still at my previous job, and we heard a lot from our client communities and from community partners about really brazen immigration enforcement, entering private workspaces without warrants, engaging in traffic stops, collaborating with local police and holding people on the side of the road for hours until ICE came. And so, all of those things that were happening to the client communities that I served at the time, I brought with me, sort of lessons and limitations in individual representation to the ACLU of Pennsylvania, and have sort of worked with trying to prioritize some of those issues at the ACLU of Pennsylvania in both litigation work and also in non-litigation advocacy work, because sometimes like you need both. You need the individual representation for people, but then you also need to work on bigger system changes. And there are within Pennsylvania and within other structures, notwithstanding sort of that the immigration laws have remained the same, people's rights have remained the same too. And so when law enforcement's engaging in pretty clear violations of the Fourth Amendment, those are actionable, constitutional claims and civil rights claims. And that's why, we've brought some cases against the police on behalf of clients. But yeah, I mean, I think that, I guess I'll also say that the pandemic specifically and the way in which people have been treated in immigration detention during the pandemic, I think really highlights just how awful of an immigration system that we have, that, there's been a huge fight to keep people in immigration detention, including people who are at high risk of dying. And that's not disputed. It's they have medical conditions that place them at high risk, and yet ICE does not want to release them because they're subject, for instance, to mandatory detention, which is I'm doing math in my head right now, 14-year-old law, that subjects people to mandatory detention for particular criminal convictions, regardless of the fact that they already served any time that they had even been sentenced to. Many people subject to mandatory detention never actually served time because the criminal justice system judges found that they didn't need to, and yet they're subject to indefinite detention within the ICE system, and how unfair that is. So I think that in sum, to sort of wrap it all up, I think that it's it's important for us as lawyers to think about how, you know, the work in this moment is informed by so much of the sort of longstanding systems that our community partners and organizers have been working to dismantle for so long, and that, you know, we can take the heartbreaks and the lessons that we've learned over the last 4 years, you know, some of the wins, some of the losses, to continue the fight, because, you know, it's only highlighted the need to continue to work together, to make the changes that we must make for a better and more humane system.
Thanks for that, Vanessa. If I can follow up on that. So thinking about your work with community partners, as you said, thinking about the organizations and the communities that you serve, given how relentless and all-consuming resistance to immigration enforcement under this administration has become for attorneys who litigate in this field, how have you been able to maintain those relationships? How do you stay connected to communities in this moment? Umber, did you want to start?
Oh, sure. So I think, you know, I know we have a wonderful panel coming up on detention issues too, but, you know, we've also been doing a lot of detention related work, seeking release in better conditions for people inside detention centers because of the coronavirus. And I've been pretty involved with our Virginia litigation, and we've worked pretty closely with community organizations. So we're part of the Free Them All Virginia Coalition, which is largely made up of local and advocacy organizations demanding the release of all people in detention prisons and jails in Virginia. And it's been a really interesting relationship because, you know, obviously the demands for the coalition are far greater than what we're able to argue or win in court. You know, we've sought release of medically vulnerable people, we've sought better conditions, but our litigation has played an interesting role in this effort. And part of the reason why we're part of the coalition and working so closely is because through our litigation, we were able to find out really important information in sworn declarations submitted in court by ICE in the facility about what decisions are being made in the detention center, who is making them, what the results of those decisions are. And we have worked pretty closely with our partners to share that information and to figure out who to target and how to achieve those broader demands. And yeah, I think just like for some context, you know, over the summer, ICE transferred about 74 people from facilities in Arizona and Florida that had COVID cases into Farmville Detention Center in Virginia. 51 of those 74 people tested positive shortly after their transfer. And then nearly 90% of the entire facility's population tested positive, and one person died. And we later learned that like the transfer actually happened because ICE wanted to transport its officers to DC to suppress Black Lives Matter protests in DC. And that might make no sense. Why would it? But basically there's this regulation for ICE Air, the airline, that does not allow ICE officers to use the airline unless they're accompanying detained people. So they used this transfer as an excuse to bring officers into the area. And so, you know, we were unfortunately unsuccessful on our release case. And while that was on appeal, we filed another lawsuit asking for better conditions. And part of the reason why was because we were getting all of this information from the facility that was useful to our partners. And, you know, sort of given the dire situation inside Farmville, we wanted desperately to like get more information and continue the pressure. And so we were able to get a pretty quick injunction against more transfers into the facility, and also get an inspection of the facility. And last month, actually, ICE filed a motion in our case asking the judge to reconsider her injunction and allow transfers in. And this is where kind of the work with the organizers was critical, because as soon as ICE filed this motion, we were able to work with them to mobilize quickly, put pressure on elected officials, to call out ICE, to release people from detention, and then also not go through with these transfers. After a few elected officials spoke out, this also gathered media attention from like national media, local media, and actually pretty incredibly, 2 people who were detained at Farmville found out about the fact that ICE was planning to restart transfers on a newspaper, and wrote letters to the judge thanking her for placing the ban on transfers, and telling her about the awful conditions inside the facility. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but as soon as the judge informed us that she received these letters from these detained people, and she was going to submit those letters onto the public docket in our case, ICE within 20 minutes withdrew their motion. And the ban on transfers is still in effect in Farmville. And we're still continuing to work with the Free Them All VA Coalition to keep the pressure on. And I'm also happy to say that we filed an amended complaint in the case just last week, adding more people and adding damages claims for the facility's negligence in infecting people with COVID inside. So that's just like one example of, it's definitely challenging. I think there are times when obviously the limitations of litigation are very clear and apparent, but it does serve a very useful tool in support of the really incredible work that these local organizations are doing.
That's an incredible example, Umber, of not just relentless lawyering and being able to pivot when you hit a wall or you get a bad decision, but in thinking so strategically about the role of lawyering in a bigger strategy for change. And as you said, the limits of what litigation can actually accomplish, and being able to be in partnership with advocates across the spectrum. Vanessa, did you want to speak to, in this moment when there are so many barriers that are keeping a lot of us isolated in different ways, and the need for litigation is so relentless, how you can stay connected to communities?
Sure, yeah. I think, COVID has presented a lot of challenges. One of those is how to, is sort of to this question. I think, here in Pennsylvania, prior to the pandemic, I think one example of us staying connected to communities is through our state police litigation. So we have litigation right now against the Pennsylvania State Police on behalf of 11 clients who were either drivers or passengers and were stopped by the state police and then detained, sometimes for hours, for the purposes of civil immigration enforcement. But that litigation did not spring from a decision, in a vacuum by us to take action, but rather was after collaboration with community partners who had raised this issue and who we had worked with to try to advocate for a strong policy by the Pennsylvania State Police to stop profiling Latinx folks and to stop working with ICE. And after that fell short, we moved forward with the litigation, which, like I said, is ongoing at this time. So I think, that's one example. I guess I'll just say, I think it's important generally to not forget why we're doing this. So, even if we're not necessarily working in close collaboration with, say, a coalition on this work, it's trying to pull out and connect some of the larger systemic issues, right? And so, when we're seeking individual release for clients who are medically vulnerable on a writ of habeas corpus, right? It's, it's very technical and very specific. But that doesn't mean that the experiences of what our clients are facing, or sort of the information that we're learning potentially through discovery, is not useful in other ways. And so I think, you know, it's important to take a step back, which of course can be, you know, difficult when you're working on an emergency brief, but it's so important. And, you know, I'm certainly not, I have certainly not perfected that, but I think that, you know, trying to remind yourself to do that is important, and you know, sharing out information that you learn is critical, whether it's sort of within a formal coalition structure or just sort of with community partners who are working on sort of these parallel issues, you know, in different ways in here in PA. So yeah.
And Vanessa, did you also have any thoughts on just thinking about lessons that we've learned about how to pivot? I think, you know, has maybe never been so crucial when you get a bad decision or you hit a wall of what you're able to accomplish in litigation. Any reflections on, you know, what we've learned about how to keep fighting and keep moving?
Sure. Yeah. You know, I'm learning that lesson right now in real time with our litigation where we had sought class certification and we're not successful in that. You know, I think that, you know,
Sorry to hear, Vanessa, do you want to give a little bit more detail about that?
Sure.
That haven't been following?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So we had started litigation back in the spring, which feels many years ago at this point, even though it's the same year, on behalf of medically vulnerable people in ICE detention. And the sort of, not to get too sort of technical, but I think it's sort of helpful to just give sort of like why medically vulnerable people in ICE detention have legal claims for release. So even though it feels like it is, even though people in ICE detention are held at jails that are county facilities here in Pennsylvania that are meant to punish people serving criminal sentences, they are legally defined as civil detainees. So civil detainees aren't permitted to be punished because they're being detained civilly, not for civil purposes, not for the purposes of punishment. And so because of that, they aren't allowed to be punished at all, actually. And they also have, under the Constitution, a right to reasonable safety when they're in the custody of the government. And that right stems from what has been more commonly developed under the Eighth Amendment for prisoners who still have a right to reasonable safety while imprisoned, but because immigration detainees are not prisoners, their rights fall under the Fifth Amendment, not the Eighth Amendment. So the legal claims that we were bringing for clients and have been bringing for clients is under that framework, both under a punishment theory, basically, which is that they're not allowed to be punished, and when you subject them to a deadly virus in which they have a high risk of serious harm or death, that constitutes punishment. And then they also have a right to reasonable safety, and they're not being kept safe because of the conditions of confinement. And so those are the two legal theories that we brought forth under habeas, which is, you know, a legal tool that we have, a long-standing legal tool, right? You know, if you ever want to, you know, get into be a historian and a lawyer at the same time, you know, you can read all about the Great Writ, which stretches back many hundreds of years. But I think it's important actually to remember, like, that is what the writ of habeas corpus is all about. It's about challenging unlawful confinement in many different forms. And, you know, within immigration, the writ, you know, again, I know there's a detention panel later, but it's been used to challenge, you know, in prolonged detention for people that are subject to detention for long periods of time. It's also been used to challenge successfully people being detained, continuing to be detained in ICE custody because they can't afford to pay their bond. So there's all different ways in which you can use the writ of habeas corpus. And so we've, used habeas in this moment to try to get medically vulnerable people out so that they can stay safe and alive, because we know, this virus is so deadly for everyone, but especially deadly for people who are medically vulnerable. I guess so, sort of with that sort of framework in mind. So, what happens when things don't go your way? Well, I think that it's, for us, we've been focusing on our clients' individual claims for release. We still have clients who are detained, and so it's about focusing, energy on that, and it's also about, I guess I think, it's. I think that bringing these types of cases is important for other reasons as well. Obviously trying to keep people safe right now is incredibly important, but I think that there are, lessons that we're learning from this work, regardless of the outcome, that I think will help inform our work going forward. And I think that that's important too, when it's, short-term losses don't necessarily mean that you won't have a victory later on. And, I think victories can take many forms, especially, when you define the work larger than sort of winning in the courtroom. And so, those are some of the ways I think that we can take the work that we're doing now to sustain us and to continue the fight.
Thanks, Vanessa. Tasha, did you want to share our first CLE secret word?
Yes. So for those seeking CLE credit, the first secret word is RBG, R as in Ruth, B as in Bader, G as in Ginsburg, RBG.
All right, one more time, RBG. If you want to take notes for your CLE credits. Great. All right, and just a reminder for the attendees, if you have questions for our panelists, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A, and I'll go ahead and monitor that, and happy to add those questions to the conversation. I wanted to think back when you said, Vanessa, that for example, discovery in a case, even if the case itself doesn't yield the result that you wanted, discovery in and of itself may be interesting for a range of reasons. And I'm thinking about the role of advocacy around transparency in the last few years, and how crucial it's been to be as aggressive as we can be in trying to make the administration's tactics transparent to communities who are impacted. And I think that that's an area where we have seen some success, and also seen legal advocates have to really expand our skills and our tools. If that's work that either of you have been engaged in, or that you have seen used successfully in ways you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that a little. I've generally come across two types of attorneys: those who love FOIA work and those who hate it. And FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. And I mean, I think that is, the transparency work is incredibly critical, not just for, like Professor Berry, you mentioned, like advocacy work and sort of public engagement, but also for our own litigation purposes. There are often times when we file a FOIA request to litigate it before we bring forth affirmative litigation, because we have a better idea of like what claims we can actually bring. One of the areas where I've been working on over the past couple of years is on denaturalization, which is the process of stripping citizenship from naturalized citizens, which again, this administration kind of took to new heights. But very little is actually known about how many people are being denaturalized, what procedures the government is using to they're basically reviewing millions of files of naturalized citizens going back decades, trying to find little errors in their applications, and then bringing civil denaturalization lawsuits against them to strip their citizenship. But very little is actually known about it. And when very little is known about it, it's very hard to put forth like an affirmative lawsuit because we don't even know what to challenge. And so we've filed several FOIA requests. We're litigating 3 FOIA requests about sort of the processes and kind of the substance of why this administration is going after the people that it's going after, and sort of more information about who is being impacted and how many people are being affected. And yeah, I just think that work is critical on like all fronts, including for like subsequent litigation, for advocacy, and for sort of public engagement, and yeah, getting people to understand like the scope of the problem.
Did you want to add anything, Vanessa?
Sure. I'm one of those lawyers that loves FOIA litigation. So we're a couple of things. One, all states, well, I think also, I shouldn't say that. Pennsylvania has a state equivalent FOIA, which is the right to know law. And it has a similar sort of pathway towards, if you can't resolve it through an administrative appeal after you send in the request to the agency, then you have to litigate it. But one nice thing about the right to know requests in Pennsylvania is that, you know, anyone can submit them, and it does not, which is the same for FOIA, but you can basically just ask what you want. You don't have to make it more formal than that. You can literally say, I would like this policy that you talked about in this article, thanks, bye. And that's sufficient, or can be sufficient to get the record. And so we've done right to know requests to county jails, to local police departments, to learn more about the policies or the lack of their policies around collaboration with ICE, which has been super helpful, both in terms of investigating you know, issues that we've heard about from community partners, and then actually sharing out that information. And some of that work is sort of ongoing in terms of then, you know, are there recommendations or strategies that can be made around strengthening different practices or policies within Pennsylvania? And then in terms of FOIA, you know, the one thing, again, sort of going back to what I had mentioned previously around, you know, ICE's enforcement actions in Pennsylvania and across the country, but especially in Pennsylvania, were particularly aggressive. And yet, you know, other than what we've heard from practitioners or from community partners, you know, little is known actually about ICE's enforcement tactics and what they've done and their purported reasons for doing them. But that information should all be documented in something called an I-213, which is ICE's record of an enforcement action and an arrest. And there's a narrative portion within that where ICE is supposed to describe sort of what they did and why they did it. And so we submitted a FOIA request for all the I-213s from the last 2 years because it was requested in 2019, and are now in litigation about that because ICE did not turn over the requests. And, you know, I think that sort of one, I guess I'll say sort of like one lesson learned about this is, you know, maybe what worked before in terms of doing a FOIA request and getting that information without having to litigate isn't working anymore, you know. And so, you know, that's, I think, sort of one, you know, lesson is that, you know, you need to have a plan in case you can't get the information in the FOIA process to be able to litigate that. And luckily we have great co-counsel, including Caitlin Berry, and cooperating counsel from Langer, Gergen, and Diver, which is the law firm, plaintiff's side law firm here in Philadelphia. And so, you know, I think that I think what's great about public records requests generally is the transparency aspect and the accountability aspect, and that sometimes you're asking for it for a particular reason, and then sometimes you're asking for it because you're actually trying to help. You're trying to inform a particular strategy or tactic that you're going to take, right? Whether that's through advocacy work or through future litigation, you know. And I think that, and sometimes you don't know until you get that information, right? But you know, regardless, we are entitled to it, and you know, sometimes that just means seeing it through to the end of litigation if necessary, or sometimes it means being able to obtain it without having to file a lawsuit.
Yeah, and I think particularly for all the immigration attorneys who are attending today, where we are very much in the mindset that we have no entitlement to anything, where we're used to carrying the entire burden and are very used to this mentality of complete government secrecy, to remember that there are actually many different avenues to try to attain those records, and that we should be using every avenue that we can to try to make the system more transparent. Some good questions are coming in the Q&A. Folks, please do keep adding them. I'm going to add one more question before turning to those questions. One of the most inspiring lessons that I think I've seen from the last few years are how many movements really pushed towards solidarity around intersecting issues in recent years. You know, if we're thinking about detention issues across, you know, the incarceration system, that it obviously wasn't just folks in the immigrants' rights world who were trying to free folks from detention, but also in thinking about intersecting issues around civil rights abuses that are being committed by different law enforcement agencies. I'd love to hear how you see your work as connected to other movements, if there are specific acts of solidarity or projects that you're working on that are sort of outside of the silo of immigrants' rights, or any lessons that you're learning from folks in other movements.
I think in particular over the summer, and with the example that I shared about sort of ICE agents being transported to suppress the Black Lives Matter protests, you know, that presented a really sort of stark example of like how like all of these movements are tied together. So when, you know, we're asking to free them all from detention, we also mean freeing everyone incarcerated in prisons and jails. And, you know, that's kind of been sort of our like outlook on it. And then the other example, I think, over the summer, which was really incredible to see, was the sort of Supreme Court victory on DACA, and how, you know, there at the time there was, you know, so many people protesting for Black Lives Matter out on the streets every day, and continue to be out on the streets every day. And I am a pretty firm believer that the Supreme Court wouldn't have decided the way that they decided if it wasn't for those protests, because the court, you know, is worried about its legitimacy, is worried about kind of how it looks to the public, and, you know, they are seeing what is happening on the streets, how people are tired of all of these systems being unjust. And so I think that even like the DACA victory in the Supreme Court is owed a lot to, you know, these other movements that have like ties to history. And it's been like pretty incredible to see, especially over the summer. And especially when, you know, during the pandemic, when there's so many injustices that are being highlighted, so many people who are in pain, and who are suffering, and there's a lot of opportunity here for people to come together, people who aren't familiar with immigrants' rights, the immigrants' rights movement, and likewise, people who aren't familiar with like other movements to come together and you know, ask for a more fair society.
Vanessa, is there anything you wanted to add?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay? I had to switch headsets. Okay. You're just seeing my full repertoire of work from home headsets, which is, as an aside, maybe some helpful practical tips for dealing with audio problems in this work from home world. But so yeah, you know, I just to add to that, I think, again, our work specifically, well, two things. One, our work against the state police, the litigation against the state police, and we also have 2 cases against local police departments here in Pennsylvania. Those are really police practice cases. It's just that our clients and the legal theory for why their rights were violated have a connection to immigration enforcement. And so with that, I think there's an opportunity, especially right now, as we're sort of dealing with, you know, as we're sort of hopefully pushing towards divesting in police departments and investing in communities, I think the litigation provides an opportunity to engage in and sort of do that work through that lens. And then I'll just also say that I think that the litigation on behalf of clients who are medically vulnerable has also just highlighted sort of the consequences of the over-policing of Black and brown communities and of racist police practices. You know, many of our clients are Black immigrants, and you know, many of them have decades-old convictions for things like, you know, for drug offenses that have, you know, that are related to, for instance, marijuana, which is, you know, now a $1 billion industry for people in certain states, and they're facing permanent exile because of their criminal conviction for that. And so, you know, I think that it's, I think it just, you know, it highlights the need, I think, for however we're doing our work to, you know, make sure that we're, you know, making space for other movements, and that it's, you know, this isn't, even though my job title says that I'm the immigrant rights attorney, doesn't mean that that's the only lens through which I do my work. And you know, I think that it's, even though it's incredibly challenging times right now, I also think that there are real opportunities for us to sort of broaden sort of the coalition work, which is already sort of, you know, multi-issue, but to really sort of push, again, just to push forward in ways to be able to, you know, make the changes that are really necessary for everyone to feel, and for everyone's lives to matter, for everyone to be safe, and to be, to have their, you know, dignity and respect actually valued in ways that it has to be.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. And Tasha, do you want to share our second CLE secret word?
Yes, the second CLE secret word is autumn. Used in a sentence: leaves are falling, autumn is calling. Again, the secret word is autumn.
Thanks, Tasha. All right, so a few practitioner questions coming in from Villanova alumnus Luis Canales. So questions about denaturalization. USCIS tells attorneys that they destroy the applicant's file once they naturalize. So questions about how to challenge that. And that the I-213 form that you referenced, Vanessa, that contains details about a person's arrest Why doesn't DHS share it, and what can we do about that?
I can take the naturalization file question. I haven't heard that USCIS destroys files, and in fact, I've gotten A files of clients who have naturalized that have their kind of all of the petitions that they've submitted to kind of come into the US, then their naturalization file application as well. If you are curious about what information USCIS has, again, we'll plug FOIA, and you can FOIA for your client or whoever submitting the request your own A file, and that they should provide you with all of the information that they have. And those actually, I know Vanessa mentioned that, under this administration, it's been very hard to get information without litigation, but typically requests for A files are a bit easier to get. It still takes a while, but it might take a couple of months, but those are things that they try to get to people. So I would recommend doing that if you're or if you're a naturalized citizen like me, you can just email or send like the FOIA request to USCIS just to know what information they have on you.
As for the I-213s, part of the reason that we're having to litigate this is because we're not just asking for an I-213 on behalf of one client, but we're asking for them from the field office for all of them, for all of the incidents, right? And so ICE had initially claimed in their denial that we needed consent forms from everyone to obtain the I-213s, which doesn't account for the fact that they could redact people's information. But, I think sort of, I'm not sure in terms of if you mean, Luis, about the I-213s and maybe why ICE doesn't give them to you always in removal proceedings. I know that can actually be a challenge sometimes. I think it can depend on the situation, but if you're contesting the person's removability and ICE doesn't want to produce the I-213, then they haven't produced anything to prove their burden, and you could move to terminate their proceedings, which would then cause them to produce the I-213, at least to the court, which then you could get a copy of it. So, I think that if you're trying to get an I-213 for a client and ICE doesn't want to give it to you, that's sort of one way to do it. If they won't give it to you, since a FOIA can, even for someone in removal proceedings, can take too long for you to be able to sort of work on a strategy. So that's sort of a practical tip, but that, it's a classic sort of it depends situation, I suppose, about how to go about doing that quickly, because sometimes, the DHS attorney will just email it to you, right? So I think it just depends on the circumstances, but yeah.
Great, thank you. So a few questions here that are asking you to get out your crystal ball and thinking about if a lot of the changes to immigration enforcement in the last few years have, as you said, Umber, relied on longstanding legal policies, laws that have been in place for long before this administration. And given that this administration has worked very hard to cultivate a lot of anti-immigrant stigma, which I would also call racism and xenophobia. What do you think the future will look like if we do have a new administration? What do you think the possibilities might be? And a question from a student about, will there really be any changes in immigration procedure if we get a new administration? Which I know that's a tough question. Either of you have thoughts on that?
I think in kind of the spirit of optimism and thinking about sort of effective strategies over the last 4 years, I think it's like important, I guess, to acknowledge that, like, I'm not especially optimistic and not under any illusions that Biden administration is going to be necessarily friendly towards immigrants or immigration issues. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that immigration has often been put to the side in the national debate, and that also, says a little bit about where like the administration's priorities would be, and how much like political capital they would want to spend to change the like 400 or so policy changes that the Trump administration has sort of engaged in or tweaked. But I think one thing that has really resonated over the last sort of few years, and that like litigation in support of sort of organizing, public engagement, mobilization can be effective. And I think that would be really crucial under a different administration. I think litigation by itself or in isolation would have a lot tougher road, but sort of using strategic litigation and then also mobilizing a lot of people to put pressure on the administration to make changes, could be effective. I saw that the question also kind of talked about current attitudes towards immigration, and yet I think what we actually see in public polling is that over the last 4 years, and in particular right now, public support for immigration, and in particular raising the level of immigration, is at an all-time high since these polls have started. And despite these terrible narratives and rhetoric and racism and xenophobia against immigrants, I think what does give me hope is that we have a lot of people on our side, and more so than what we think. And I think if we can kind of channel the power and the will of the people, we can actually push a Biden administration or a Democratic administration to make a pretty fundamental and meaningful change. But it's going to take a lot of work.
Do you have anything to add, Vanessa?
I don't really. Yeah, I think it's a tough question, and I think regardless of the administration, I think the sort of the collaborative work between lawyers and organizers has to continue, and I think it's hard to predict the future, and I guess what I'll say is, I think it's important to, it will be important, regardless of the outcome of the election, to sort of like continue some of the work that's been going on, and to figure out ways to hold the government accountable, both in the courts and in the streets. So
thank you for that. All right, so one more question from another alum, Garrett Trier. So what are some practical ways that non-immigration lawyers or non-lawyers contributed to your efforts, and are there ways by which they could make helpful contributions to your work going forward? For any of our alumni who would like to maybe volunteer or do some pro bono work, do you have any thoughts on how they may contribute to the amazing work you're both doing?
So I can start. We again, I'm talking about the ACLU of Pennsylvania's work through sort of the immigrant rights lens that we do, but it's not the only work that we're doing. We're also doing voting rights work. We're also doing criminal justice reform work, and we need attorney volunteers for this election, which is, we're a nonpartisan organization, and so our voter protection work is not partisan. And, so I guess what I'll say is, when you support when you sort of plug into volunteer opportunities generally with the ACLU of Pennsylvania, you're helping all of us, because, you know, we're a, you know, our legal department, you know, relies on attorney volunteers to do work, and it allows, you know, it allows all of us to sort of maximize the work and time that we're doing. So I guess it's like, you know, you could help advance immigrant rights by also helping to protect people's right to vote, you know. So I guess I would encourage you to think about volunteer opportunities in that way. But yeah, for folks who are interested, you know, we have the volunteer information up on our website generally, and you know, we've also done some specific outreach about voter protection work for this election. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I'm happy to sort of pass it along if that's helpful. And, you know, and I think for attorneys, for instance, who are at, you know, in private practice or at law firms, the ACLU of Pennsylvania we wouldn't be able to do our work if we didn't have cooperating counsel, which is co-counsel basically in cases, and that's incredibly important for us to be able to, again, sort of maximize the work that we're able to do by working collaboratively with pro bono partners to litigate our cases. And so, you know, if you're interested in this and you're not sure whether your firm is someone who has collaborated with us, you know, I'd encourage you to look into that and to figure out ways to plug in or to encourage your firms to work with us, because I think it's, you know, it's another great way for you to, you know, help do this work in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if folks are especially interested in some of the like detention work in the DMV area, you know, I would recommend sort of checking out the Free the Mall Virginia Coalition, and in particular, sort of local organizations like Sanctuary DMV and La Colectiva. And I'm sure they're like organizations in whatever area you're in that kind of do similar work. So I would definitely recommend like getting engaged with that. You know, and they often kind of have relationships with people in detention and support people in detention by like putting money in commissary and like supporting other needs. So there's definitely a huge need there, especially during the pandemic. And in terms of NIPNLG, I will plug that we are a membership-based organization, and our members are immigration attorneys for the most part, but we also have non-attorneys, support staff, and law students who are members. So if you're interested in sort of the work that we're doing, want to keep updated and see of ways to kind of plug in, I would encourage you all to become members as well.
Thank you so much, Umber. The National Immigration Project was an unbelievable source of expertise and support for me when I was getting started, and so can't recommend them enough to folks who are starting out. Just want to thank you both so much. We are coming up on an hour, and in listening to both of you, I think I'm definitely reflecting on the need to be as creative as possible and thinking about all of the different tools that you just highlighted and being a resource to movements that are fighting for immigrant justice in this moment, from FOI litigation and other kinds of transparency, advocacy, detention issues related around both conditions of detention and getting people free, fighting individual cases, bringing civil rights challenges, you know, fighting for injunctions that are going to stop future human rights abuses. And just thinking about the incredible scope of the work that you all are doing. And for those of us who don't work at organizations where you're able to provide all of that in one place, and thinking how important our strong relationships are with other advocates, with community leaders, with folks who are bringing all different kinds of advocacy resources to the table, that none of us are able to do this alone, and most certainly not lawyers. And so thinking about all the lessons and the incredibly inspiring collective action that we've been able to witness in recent years. And thank you both so much for sharing those reflections with us. And so just wanted to let folks know that we will email the sketchnote graphic to everyone who attended today, as well as the website with additional resources and articles. And a reminder that there will be another panel today at 4:30 on the Black immigrant experience with some amazing speakers who are going to be focusing the conversation. Tasha, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Berry. Just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and also thanking you, Professor Berry, for your wonderful facilitation, for your willingness to moderate. Of course, Amber and Vanessa for taking time to share your expertise. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing your incredible talent by creating this amazing and beautiful live sketch. We will be emailing that out, as Professor Berry said, with the resource link. And then our other panels are, one is today, the Black Immigrant Experience at 4:30, and then tomorrow we have a detention panel, and next Monday, a panel discussing ICE surveillance of a local pastor for her work with immigrant communities. So thank you all and have a wonderful week.